What's up guys, Rotozap here, and today we're going to be answering the question that everyone has for their favorite MMORPG. What class should I play? Except in Wizard101 we call them schools, so what school should you play? So I'm just going to be doing an overview of every school and kind of what I think the pros and cons are, as well as what kind of person would enjoy the school. So I think we're going to start off first with the Storm School. So Storm is interesting because they have the highest damage output in the game in theory, and they also just have a lot of really powerful hits, and that makes them really good for questing, of course, because they just do so much damage, you know. But there's kind of a bad side to Storm as well, because even though you are doing a lot of damage, you don't really have any sustain. In fact, your health is abysmal compared to the other schools. And starting off leveling, it's not as apparent, but when you get up into the hundreds, it can become really noticeable that you're at a very major disadvantage in terms of health and even resist at sometimes, which kind of makes you a glass cannon. But you know, Storm is just really good as long as they have a partner. So from a questing side of things, Storm is probably the best school in the game at questing. Like I said, you're going to have some survivability problems when you get into the upper levels and some of the harder worlds. But as long as you have, it can even just be one person to help you out, that can be enough to get you the win. And it doesn't even need to be a healer, right? Even double Storm has enough damage output to stay alive. But that's kind of the trade-off of it, is you're doing a lot of damage, but in return, you're just not, you know, you're not even remotely tanky. But Storm has a lot of really nice hitting spells like Tempest. It's an X-Pip AoE, which is incredible. So, you know, you use a Storm Lord or something, doesn't kill everyone. Very next turn you can Tempest because there is no minimum pip requirement for Tempest. So they're just very good questers and also really good farmers, which is why a lot of people will max them, is so that they have a good farmer on their account. But from a PvP side, Storm is You know, Storm is a very gambler kind of school. You know, they have a lot of really interesting spells that are random, like Healing Current, Wild Bolt, Insane Bolt. There's a lot of things that could happen, but they might not, if that makes any sense. So what kind of person would I recommend play a Storm Wizard? I would like Storm if I was a risk reward kind of player, and that's who I recommend this kind of school to, is if you're, you know, risk reward. The risk of playing Storm is that you're not tanky, you don't have a lot of health. The reward is that you do a lot of damage. And there's also just other gambler aspects of it, because like I said, Wild Bolt can be 1,000 damage for 2 pips, but it can also be 100 damage for 2 pips. So, you know, there's that. And there's also Insane Bolt, which is like the ultimate gamble. Either 1,000 damage to your opponent, or I think it's 10,000 damage to yourself. That's insane. That really is insane. So you're gonna like Storm if you like playstyles that are very risky, high damage, high intensity, quick matches in PvP. That's just the name of the game of Storm, is they're quick, they're gambling, and they are fun to play. But moving on to our next school, let's talk about Ice. Alright, next up, we got Ice. So I'm just going to cut to the chase and tell you that if you really just want the school that is probably the best in the game, Ice is going to be it. They're just very good at PvE and they're very good at PvP. So all that into account, they're probably just the best school overall. But I don't know. Honestly though, like, Ice is really good. Like, I just don't have a lot of negative things to say about Ice. I'm trying to think of some, but I don't have any. But really, Ice is like specialty. Their main stats are health and resistance. So they're a very tanky school. And they sacrifice in damage quite a bit because of that. But, you know, with all the different blades that you can put on and all the different buffs, Ice really is not struggling to get decent damage. So you're not going to be questing as fast as something like a storm or fire, but you're going to not have to worry about dying so often because, like I said, ice is just super tanky. So that's them from a PvE standpoint. From a PvP standpoint, ice is just broken. I mean, ice is really the only school in the game that can be played at virtually any level and remain a top tier school in PvP. Like, you can play ice at Grandmaster, Magus, Legendary, Exalted, Max, you name it, ice is going to be a top tier school when it's played there. So ice in that regard is really good. They are probably the best school in PvP overall. It's kind of a, I don't know, an opinion whether they're the best at Legendary and Max or not, but definitely at like a lot of these middle, random level ranges, they are probably the best. But cons for ice, well, there really aren't any. Like I said, you're just not going to be questing all that fast, but at the same time, ice does get access to a lot of AoEs, so you're not really going to be worried about dealing with like, oh, I can't hit a lot of enemies at one time, because you get Blizzard really early, you get Frost Giant pretty soon after, and then you get Snow Angel right after that. So you've got AoEs that will take things out pretty easily. So I don't even know, like, questing isn't that bad. It just doesn't, fly by like it would on certain schools. But that's all I've really got to say about ice. The kind of person that should play ice is either if you enjoy that slower play style where you're tanking hits really well and dishing out damage over time, or you're the kind of person that just wants to play the best school. You're the kind of person that looks at the tier list, picks whatever is an S, and then goes on from there. So if you want ice because it's the best school, play it because of that. If you want ice because you like the slower play style, you like tanking, then do that. Ice is good for a couple different people. But moving on, next we're going to talk about fire. Alright, you should play fire because it has the most lit professor. Not really. Well, I mean, yeah, but fire is just a good school. That's why you should play fire, because it's a good school. So fire is another one of those attack specialized schools. They have good damage and they dish out a lot of damage. They have AoEs. They're good for questing. And honestly, I kind of like questing on a fire a little bit more than a storm, because the big difference between fire and storm is that storm is more, like I said, gamble based, risk reward kind of gameplay. Fire is kind of just like they do damage and they can kind of tank. They just have a little bit better stats than storm when it comes to health and resistance, and that little bit is kind of enough to put them ahead of storm, in my book at least, because I don't like how much storm dies in questing, especially when you get to like the higher worlds. If you're solo questing, it can be really hard, and even on a fire it can be hard sometimes, because you still don't have a lot of health, you still don't have a lot of resist. So it can even be hard on a fire, but it is going to be easier to stay alive on a fire than it is a storm, and the damage is relatively the same. The way I describe fire is it's kind of just a more reliable storm, and really that's kind of the person that would play a fire character, is if they want to see high numbers, they want flashy cool spells, they like quickness in battle, but they're not so into the gambling aspect. They're not so into the fact that you could do way more damage, but you could also do way less, and also you're made of glass. But it's just fire is kind of just a more reliable storm. That's why I like them, and honestly that's why they're just better in PvP typically. It's also the fact that fire literally has the best 8 pip spell in the game, the best 5 pip spell in the game, and they have really good shadow spells as well as utility spells like Fire Beetle and stuff. So fire just is a very good school. They have very strong spells, and like I said, in questing they're good, and in just regular PvP gameplay Again, they dominate at Legendary and Max, but I've also seen them used at like Grandmaster on occasion in Magus. So, you know, they're just good at PvP. The top 3 schools for PvP really are Balance, Ice, and Fire. So again, if you want that sort of questing, you like quick questing, you like the fire spells, but you also want a school that's going to be good at PvP in the long run, Fire is probably the school for you. So, but wrapping up here, the only cons to Fire, you know, like I said, they're little on the frail side. You know, they don't have that much health, they don't have that much resistance, but you're really not going to encounter problems with dying until you get to the upper worlds. So yeah, that's all I've got to say for Fire. Play Fire if you want to play Storm, but you don't want to die as often, I guess is the way I can put it. You're going to do a little less damage, but generally I just think that Fire is probably a better school than Storm. But that's all I've got to say. We're going to be moving into the spiritual schools now, kicking it off with Myth. Myth, the school with the rudest professor, Cyrus Drake, has a lot of interesting things to offer. So Myth has this gimmick of minions. That's like their big thing. They have a bunch of different minions that you can summon in PvE and PvP to aid you in battle. But the thing is, these minions are cool, but outside of like level 60 PvP, which uses Talos the minion, and max level, which uses like Witch's House Call, which just also has a secondary effect of summoning a minion, you know, these minions are not really getting used all that often. And like I said, they're kind of just like a gimmick that Myth has. But I really do feel like the minions would be used more often if Myth was given more spells that did damage as well as summon a minion. If we had more things like that, then I'm sure Myth Wizards would be using their minion a lot more often. But when you have to just sacrifice pips and use an entire turn to get your minion out, sometimes that's just not feasible. And when it comes to like PvE, why would you get a minion out when you could just be blade stacking and building pips to just one-shot the boss or whatever? Or why would you ever use this in like a mob battle? So I don't know, it's just Myth Wizards, like, they have their minions, but they can be kind of gimmicky and outside of a couple cases really not even used. So what does Myth offer besides the minions? Well, they also have a lot of stunning spells. So does Ice. Ice has stun spells too, but Myth is the only school in the game that has a spell that can stun the opponent for 2 rounds, which is crazy. So Myth definitely has a lot of stunning spells. In terms of stat breakdown, Myth is just very like balanced. You know, they don't do as much damage as like a Fire or Storm, but they also aren't quite as weak as like a Life or Balance. So they're very middle of the road in terms of damage. Same with resistance and health. They don't have the worst, but they don't have the best. And really, Myth is kind of just like a mid-tier school. You know, even like in PvP and stuff, they are very middle of the road. If you have a Myth Wizard that knows what they're doing with good stats, they're going to get wins. They can get Warlord, no problem, but it's just a very mid-tier school. So I think the big appeal that people have for Myth is they like the minions and they just like mythology, because a lot of Myth spells are based off mythology, and that's why a lot of people like them. You know, I have a lot of friends that main Myth, or, you know, Myth is just like a cult favorite because they like the spells so much. So the kind of people that should probably play Myth are the kinds that will enjoy the spells. They don't mind the fact that they're going to probably not be the best, but not be the worst either. And also not mind a little more tedious questing, because Myth doesn't really get many AoEs. They get Humongo Frog and Earthquake, and Earthquake is a great utility spell, but in terms of damage, it's very on par with Humongo Frog. So Myth doesn't get a lot of AoEs that you're going to be able to blade stack into and use until they get Mystic Colossus at level 100. So just keep that in mind when you're making a myth. It's going to be a little more tedious to quest, but overall, like I said, if you're into mythology, you like all the really unique spells, you like the minions, then Myth is going to be a great school for you, and you're going to have fun playing Myth, because that's important too. When you're making a school on Wizard101, you don't just want to play because they have good endgame in PvP, or they're just really strong. You know, it's about having fun while playing, and I think that Myth is a fun school to play. So, like I said, if you're a player that's into mythology, minions, and fun, Myth is probably the school for you. But coming up next, we're going to talk about life. So up next, we have life, like I said. And I think for this one, I just want to talk about the cons first and get those out of the way, and then move on to the things that are good about life. So a couple of the problems that you're going to be having with life are that they don't get an AoE spell until level 58. And that's brutal. I mean, that means you're going to have to basically go all the way through Celestia, you know, not getting any sort of AoE spell. So, I mean, what my life did when I was questing on my life was I actually used a Fire Mastery and used TC Meteors. So, you can do that, but I'm just telling you right now, it's going to be kind of annoying to quest on a life character because you just don't have any AoEs. But really, that's like kind of the only downside of life, is that they don't have AoEs, so they're not great at questing, and they also just don't do a lot of damage, so they're not great at questing. But outside of that, life is a pretty good PvP school, and life is just a good school in general. Like, don't discount life, because a lot of people just assume that life is a support school and they can't do any sorts of damage or whatever, and that's just not the case. Life is fully capable of doing damage. You know, they can hit, they are solid, they have good utility spells for PvP and stuff. They're a good school. So life, though, their main thing is healing, obviously. So when we think of a support school, you know, in other MMORPGs, you know, a support class typically does buffs, they do debuffs on the opponent, they do healing. They're kind of like an all-in-one thing, but that's not really the case with Wizard101. Life doesn't really buff people, they just heal. Their big thing is healing. So, that being said, life is not a school that you're really going to have to worry about dying with when you're questing, which is a huge perk. Obviously, it's going to take longer to quest because your spells don't hit that hard and you don't have a lot of options for taking out multiple opponents at once, but at the same time, you are doing fair damage, and you have so many heals, and your resistance is decent, and you have good health, that you're not gonna die. And on top of that, if you're questing with other people, you know, you can just serve as a support role and keep them alive. Like, just quest with a storm, and the storm will be able to do enough damage to kill everything, and you just keep them alive. So life has good synergy with other schools, and they're overall just a good school. At PvP, you know, they're like okay. They're used at Grandmaster sometimes, and the other place they're used kind of often is Exalted. But really, life is like great at level 120 PvP, because at level 120 PvP, you can get really high critical, as well as maintaining high damage and high resist and all that. And it makes it so that you can be a hitting school that can also heal for a ridiculous amount, because even though criticals were nerfed in PvP so that they don't, you know, they're not double damage anymore, heals are still double. So you can hit someone really hard with a spell, and then the very next turn, Satyr crit and do like almost 4k on a Satyr. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, that's half your health from a 4 pip heal. That's crazy, you know, and that much damage too. Like, that heals off so much damage. That heals off a shadow spell. So, you know, life is really strong, and of course they can abuse the crap out of Guardian Spirit, which is also really good. So life is in a pretty good spot for PvP at the higher levels, but like I said, they're not a great questing school until you get that Forest Lord at level 58. But As soon as you get Forest Lord, things get like exponentially easier because, like I said, you're already super tanky. Like, you've got a lot of survivability in the fact that you can heal. So when the game finally gives you things that you can work with, life can do a lot. So yeah, that's all I've really got to say about life. The kind of person that should play a life character, very obviously, you know, if you don't want to be the star of the show, like the big analogy I have for life is you don't want to be the star of the show, but you want to be behind the scenes making everything happen. You know, you're not necessarily going to be the one that gets the big hit on the boss to kill it, but you're the one that kept everyone on the team alive long enough for them to be able to do that hit. Because, you know, some of the harder bosses, you might need a healer. So life plays that role very, very well. So, like I said, if you're okay with being a more supportive school and you like that playstyle of PvP when you get into the upper levels, go for life. Honestly, life is a good school. Even though they are support, they can, in the PvP realm of things, dish out a lot of damage, and they're a high tier school when it comes to PvP. So yeah, life is just overall a good school. That's all I've got to say about it, though. Let's move on to the gloomiest of the schools, and the last spiritual school, Death. So, wrapping it up with the spiritual schools, we got Death. And Death, I would say, has the most diverse set of spells in the game. They have a lot of different unique utility spells. They have a lot of unique hits. They have a lot of different mechanics. Death just has a lot of different things going on with it. It's got overtimes, single hits, utility spells. They kind of have it all. So that's kind of one of the big draws to Death. But let's talk about PvE real quick, because Death is in a similar state that Life is in, because they don't get an AoE until level 48, which isn't as bad as level 58, but the thing that sucks about the one that they do get at level 48 is that it's a drain spell. So it is nice because you heal back on the damage that you do, but when you get to upper levels and you start getting enchants, the way drains work in the game currently, the full amount of the enchant is not applied to the hit. So you're not getting the full damage potential that you could be. And the fact that it's a drain and an AoE already means that the base damage is worse than usual. So you're going to have to use quite a bit of blades to get kills with your Scarecrow. And that's okay, but like I said, just keep in mind that Death is also not a school that is that fun to quest with. If you have Deer Knight, though, that is kind of a game changer, because you can have a really strong 5 pip AoE spell. So, like, my Legend Death that I'm questing on right now has Deer Knight, and it makes questing so much easier. So if you have Deer Knight, things are going to be a lot easier for you, but if you don't, it's not the end of the world. It's just going to be a little tricky to quest. But in terms of stats, Death is kind of like more on the tanky side, but, you know, I don't know. They're very similar to Myth, where they just have kind of balanced overall stats. A little worse damage than Myth, but a little more tank at the same time. So who would play a Death Wizard? Like, let's be honest here. Well, if you like variety and you like the whole aesthetic of being a Death Wizard, you know, that's who would play this, because like I said, you just get so many different spells. Like, you have Bone Dragon, which is a super strong AoE. You have really, or not AoE, over, like, it's an overtime. And then you have really cool spells like Headless Horseman that are just regular old hits that do a lot of damage for low pips. And then you have a lot of utility spells like Empower, Dark Pact, Bad Juju, Virulent Plague, Regular Plague, Infection, Mass Infection. They have so many different spells, and they're one of the best 2v2 or 4v4 schools in the game. If you don't have a Death on your team for a 2v2 or 4v4, then what are you doing? Because they're just so good. And they fit the role of a Jade as well. Really, really good. Like, you can put a Life Mastery on a Death, and honestly, they almost do a better job than Life at healing. So, I don't know. Death is a really good school. It's underrated for sure. But in terms of PvP, I mean, they're kind of like mid-tier, you know? In 1v1s at least. Like I said, in 2v2s, they're phenomenal for PvP, but in a 1v1, they're kind of mid-tier. Like Scion makes them a lot better, but, you know, they're okay. You know, they're a mid-tier school. They're about in the same place as Myth. They're definitely a school that requires skill to use because, like I said, you've got so many different spells. It's kind of hard to really figure out when to use all these different spells that you have. So it does take a little bit more skill to play a death successfully, but don't let that turn you away from playing it because it is a really fun school. So wrapping this up here, who do I recommend a Death Wizard to? Well, if you're the kind of person that likes spell variety and you like being able to do a bunch of different things, as well as the fact that, you know, it's a little challenging. So, you know, if you like a little bit of a challenge when it comes to these things, I definitely recommend a Death Wizard. It's for the person that's like the skill player, you know, someone that's looking for a bit of a challenge, looking to really learn the school as opposed to just go through the motions. And I think that they're really going to enjoy the Death School. But wrapping this up here with the last, but certainly not least, school, we have Balance. So as you can see by the upper left-hand corner, I don't quite have the membership to take you to the Balance School, but I will take you to Arthur Weathersfield, the stand-in instructor for Balance that we have in Ravenwood. It's not quite as good, but it'll serve its purpose. So anyway, Balance is anything but balanced, if I'm being honest. Balance is a very broken school. They're so strong. The only reason that I don't say that they're the best school in the game is because Ice is better at PvE than them. But outside of that, I mean, Balance is really right up there with Ice in terms of PvP. I mean, some people even argue that Balance is better than Ice at PvP. And really, the big difference between Ice and Balance is that Ice just has way more utility behind it. But I want to talk about PvE and kind of like an aspect of Balance that a lot of people don't really take into account. Balance is honestly the most underrated support school that we have in the game. They have so many blades, traps, debuffs, even a heal. I mean, Balance just has so many things to offer a team. It's kind of crazy. They are very underrated in terms of support when it comes to questing or really anything. I mean, they're very good. So like I said, don't sleep on Balance thinking that, oh, you know, it's Balance, like it doesn't do that much damage, etc., etc. You know, they're not great at PvE. As soon as you put them in a team, they're going to be like the star of the show because they just have so many different buffs to give people, so many different debuffs to put on bosses. They're honestly very underrated for PvE. But if you're solo questing on a Balance for PvE, things are kind of rough because Balance doesn't have a prism and they don't really have good spells that do damage that is not Balance. So for any sort of Balance bosses in Wizard101 for PvE, good luck. That's literally been a struggle since the game came out for Balance, is to deal with Balance bosses. Because Hydra and Chimera just do not cut it, but, you know. Anyway, but Balance can't have everything, so I guess it's kind of fair. But like I said, as soon as you put Balance in a team of any kind, they're really going to be able to support that whole team and really carry their weight on the team. But in PvP, things are very different. Balance is the star of the show. You know, since they have so many really great utility spells like Supernova, Mana Burn, Lore Master, they're just so good. And the reason that they are so good is because their utility spells aren't regular utility spells. They do damage as well as function as utility spells. Like Lore Master hits really hard, but it also puts on a -20 weakness and a -35 accuracy debuff. That's crazy. Like, that's a really good utility spell on its own. Like, if Balance had a 0 pip spell that put on the accuracy debuff and weakness, that would already be good on its own. But the fact that you're able to do like over 1,000 damage for a 4-pip spell, as well as put on those debuffs. That's just crazy. Same thing for Mana Burn. You do so much damage and you make your target lose pips. Supernova, same deal. For 2 pips, the spell has a base of like 800 damage when it's enchanted, and it destroys the target's aura. Now, of course, you can only use it when they have an aura, but that's besides the fact. It basically makes us... yeah, I mean, your opponent can't aura when they're up against balance. It's just not a good idea. So, balance just has a lot of utility. So, who do I recommend a balance player to? So, I recommend balance to someone that's like kind of on the fence of whether or not they want to be support, but definitely wants good options in terms of PvP, and they want to be able to do 1v1s and stuff, and they want to be successful in PvP, but they also want to kind of tiptoe on the edge of being a support class. And that's honestly why balance is my personal favorite school, because I like being able to play a support role whenever I want to, and then turn around, go into the arena, and wreck face. Like, that's a fun balance for me. Haha, balance. But like I said, though, balance is really anything but balance. They're an extremely good school, very, very top tier in every regard. So that kind of concludes the video here. That's all 7 schools. So let me know in the comments what school you think you want to be, what, if you're making a new character, what you're going to make, and let me know why. Because like I said, every single school has good things about it, every single school has bad things about it. And what's more interesting is that every school has a unique factor to it. Like I said, Storm is they're unopposed in damage. Ice is unopposed in tankiness. Fire is very good at hitting as well as tanking. Death is good at drains and utility and stuff. Myth has minions and cool spells and fun play styles. Life is the best healer in the game. Every single school has something going for it. So why not try them all, right? But if you're looking for what to make next, hopefully this video helped you guys out. That's all I've got for you guys today. Rotozap out. Peace.